Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our topic for today, which entitled The Victorian Period spanning around 1832 to 1901. So, you might ask or wondering what is Victorian period all about? What are the significance of this period? And what are the contributions of this era, specifically in English literature or in American literature in Britain? So let us know what is Victorian period. Victorian period spanning around 1832 to 1901. This era is marked by significant social, cultural, and technological changes as well as the growth of the British Empire. The Victorian literature also reflects the complex dynamics of the time, addressing issues such as industrialization, social reform, gender roles, and the tension between traditional and progress. And also, it has the key features. These are the key features of the Victorian period. But before we dig deeper into this topic, let us know first who is Queen Victoria. So, Queen Victoria in Britain, also known as Alexandrina Victoria, was born at Kensington Palace, London on May 24, 1819. And she is the daughter of Mr. Edward Duke of Kent, fourth son of the George III. And she also influenced by the two men, her first prime minister, which names Lord Melbourne, and her husband, Prince Albert, whom she married in 1840. Queen Victoria is associated with Britain's age of industrial expansion, economic progress, and especially empire. Her father died shortly after her birth, and she became heir to the throne because her three uncles who were ahead of her in the succession, Mr. George IV, Frederick, Duke of York, and William IV, had no legitimate children who survived. That's why she became heir to the position as a queen at the age of 18. So, in the early part of her reign, she was influenced by two men. Her first prime minister, Lord Melbourne, and then her husband, Prince Albert, whom she married in 1840. So both men taught her much about how to be a ruler in a constitutional monarchy in which the monarch had very few powers but could use much influence. Prince Albert, her husband, took an active interest in arts, science, and trade industry. The project for which he was best remembered was the Great Exhibition of 1851. So the prophet which helped to establish the South Kensington Museums complex in London. Queen Victoria also, her marriage to Prince Albert produced 9 children between 1840 to 1857. And another fact for Queen Victoria, she was deeply attached to her husband to the point that she sank into depression after her husband died at the age of 42 in 1861. And lastly, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House in the Isle of Wight on January 22, 1901 due to cerebral hemorrhage, which is, a type of stroke. Now let's move to the first key features under Victorian period, which is realism and social realism. Realism and social realism address social issues and depict the realities of society, say for instance the working class struggles and challenges faced by women. Another meaning of realism is that it is based on facts and what are possible, like working class struggles, unskilled laborers who worked in brutal and unsanitary conditions, working long hours, no electricity, women are only housewives and unimportant. So that is the realism. Realism also aims to portray realistic events happening to realistic people in a realistic way. It was the dominant narrative mode of the Victorian novel, but it had many variants like social realism, which focuses on the foibles, eccentricities, and remarkable characteristics of people who are frequently caricatured. So, often comic and sometimes tragicomic, it is best exemplified by the work of Charles Dickens in novels like Oliver Twist in 1837 to 1839, in which Dickens uses the plight of the orphan Oliver to critique a heartless orphanage overseen by eccentric bumblers. So Dickens both criticized the social system and created a vibrant world of memorable characters. So his masterpiece like Bleak House and yes, such. The next key features under Victorian period is the novel dominance. So what is the dominance of the novel under this period? So from poetry in novel, more people became literate and easy accessibility due to industrial revolution. Prior to the Victorian era, poetry had been the dominant form of literature. However, changes in class structure saw the novel rise in popularity. As the middle class expanded and more people became literate, the popularity of the novel exploded. So these works also became more accessible as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of newspapers and the periodical press. Most notably, the works of Charles Dickens were frequently serialized in newspapers or journals, his first being Pickwick Papers in 1836. As a result of this serialization and focus on character rather than plot, Dickens' works are sometimes criticized for having weak plots. So the subject matter of realistic Victorian novels also helped increase their popularity. Dickens particularly would portray the lives of working class people, creating characters that the new rising middle class audience could relate to. So the realistic Victorian novel focused on the characters and themes such as the plight of the poor and social mobility that was being afforded to a new middle class, and the rising middle class were eager to consume these novels. Another key features under Victorian period is the moral and ethical concerns. So the era is notable because it was associated with a certain set of social mores and values that to some extent remains to this day. So Victorian morality is associated with family values, charity, and thriftiness along with sexual repression. So these values conflict with the social tendencies of the time, including rampant prostitution, child labor, and the exploitation of the lower classes. In family structure, the family's duties is for Victorian parents, the upbringing of their children was the most important responsibility. They believed that a child must know right from wrong in order to adhere to the strict moral code as an adult. So, as such, consequences were freely given to those children who did not follow the rules. So, truthfulness was another Victorian moral that was taken very seriously. This idea was utilized as a way in which to determine someone's character. Victorians valued the moral character of a person more than the factual basis of his or her assertions. So, moving forward, in charity, Victorian era charities saw the role of the church start evolving, becoming the main instrument of charity. Charity was about involving every being in some kind of social service and good work. Next is in sexual property. The ideas of prudery and repression were features in the Victorian era code of morality, though there is evidence of the existence of a small collection of erotica from the Victorian era, one of the most famous being My Secret Life, which was written by someone anonymous and discreetly distributed in the late 19th century. However, verbal and written communications regarding sexual and emotions were often conveyed by using what was known as the language of flowers. So, more specifically, it became popular to use the word flowers to send or to use flowers to send secretive messages of affection and love. So during during the Victorian era, the publication of flower dictionaries explaining the meaning of, plants, flowers, and herbs sparked the spread of this language throughout Europe. So this was important because The same flower can have opposite meanings depending on how it was arranged or delivered. So another information about sexual property in under Victorian era or period, different social classes in Victorian times were held to different standards when it came to sexual property. Like in the upper and middle class, women were expected to have no sexual relations before marriage. So women are need to have or they need to get married first before they allowed to, enter sexual relations. So the only premarital sex that would take place would be between men and servants or prostitutes because the upper and middle class women would not go against the standards of accepted sexual conduct. So that is all about the moral and ethical concerns, key features under the Victorian period. So the next key features under the Victorian era or the Victorian period is the historical and social context. So the main features involved in the Industrial Revolution were technological, socio-economic, and cultural. The technological changes included the following like the use of new basic materials, chiefly iron and steel, the use of new energy sources, including both fuels and motive power such as coal, the steam engine, electricity, petroleum, and the internal combustion engine. So, in historical and social context, the Victorian era saw revolutionary breakthroughs in the arts and sciences, which shaped the world as we knew it today. These transformations led to many social changes with the birth and spread of political movements, most notably socialism, liberalism, and organized feminism. So there were huge social costs. The dehumanization of work, child labor, pollution, and the growth of cities where poverty, filth, and disease flourished. Child labor and poverty were also a feature of our rural life, where farm work involved long hours, very very low pay, and exposure to all weathers. We have here the social reforms, the growth of democracy, the idealization of the family. In social reforms, as a result of early campaigns by people such as Michael Sadler and the Earl of Shaftesbury, and reports by parliamentary commissions, legislation protecting child and adult workers began to be enacted. Important reforms included legislation on child labor, safety in mines and factories, public health, the end of slavery in the British Empire, and education. By 1880, education was compulsory for all children up to the age of 10. Next is the growth of democracy. The franchise was gradually extended to the working classes until by 1918 there was universal suffrage for men. The fight for votes for women was in full swing, but it was not until 1930 that women achieved the same voting rights as men. So last is the idealization of the family. The ideal of family, respectable and loving, dominated the Victorian period. The cult of the home grew steadily, with Queen Victoria and her family providing a role model for the nation. Women were expected to stay at home and bring up the family, but the reality for many poor families was that women had to work, and many single middle class women also had to work. So another key features under Victorian era is the Gothic and supernatural. So the Gothic and supernatural was an important aspect of Victorian society. It pervaded all forms of art and science as well as Victorians' daily lives, and its language and metaphors impregnated Victorian culture. So the 19th century understanding of the supernatural was hotly contested, including by theologians, and as a result, the category of the supernatural was a slippery one, but it was commonly held that it encompassed both the otherworldly, the strange in the unseen, and the ordinary in the material. The supernatural was as important as the realm of the natural in Victorian times, as is proven by its relevance in political, cultural and religious history, and in the incipient entertainment industry. So, etymologically speaking, the term supernatural refers to what is superior or above nature. However, there are several interpretations of the word supernatural which are generally accepted by the critics: preternatural, spiritual or paranormal, and supernatural. So the natural of the supernatural inhabit the same ontological space. So, in Victorian times, these three interpretations coexisted. The supernatural belief was understood as a response to Victorian crisis of faith and also as a part of a broader cultural discourse about scientific knowledge and the modern society. One of the examples of this is the Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, the first true work in the Gothic fiction. So, in the analysis of this story, in the Castle of Otranto, Walpole combines ancient and modern literary motifs. Walpole draws fantastic and supernatural elements from the medieval romances of the 12th and 13th centuries and blends them with elements of contemporary realist fiction of the 18th century, as he explains in the preface to the second edition 165 of his novel. On the other hand, Dracula's role in Victorian literature, Dracula, published in 1897, stood out in Victorian literature for its unique blend of folklore, horror, and contemporary concerns. So the novel was not the first to feature a vampire, but it was revolutionary, and its detailed portrayal of the vampire count and its use of modern narrative techniques. So Strucker's Dracula was a figure that embodied the anxieties of the Victorian age, the fear of the foreign invader, the tensions between science and superstition, and the complexities of sexuality and desire. So the novel's epistolary format, with its collection of diary entries, letters, and newspapers clippings, gave it a sense of immediacy and realism that was innovative for its time. So, Dracula's role in Victorian literature was to challenge readers with a story that was at once a thrilling horror tale and a complex social commentary. The character of Dracula became a fixture in the literary canon, influencing countless works and establishing the vampire as a symbol in literature. And now, let us welcome Ms. Isaiah Rodriguez to discuss the other key features under Victorian period.
Now, moving on to the next key feature of the Victorian era, the poetry diversity. Victorian poetry ranged from the introspective and confessional works of Alfred Lord Tennyson to the dramatic monologues of Robert Browning. Alfred Lord Tennyson is an English poet often regarded as the chief representative of the Victorian age in poetry. I've included one of his famous works, which is the Ulysses, or the Latinized word for Odysseus. And this dramatic monologue revolves around the life of Odysseus after he returned to Ithaca and how he wanted to travel again. And of course, Robert Browning, an English poet and playwright whose dramatic monologues put him high among the Victorian poets. I've also included one of his famous works, which is My Last Duchess. It is a dramatic monologue, and it is about a jealousy and possessiveness within a marriage, gendered expectations of women, and the treatment of women as chattel. Next is aestheticism and decadence. So both of these are movements during the Victorian era. And aestheticism is about beauty, and decadence is from the word decay or decline of Roman Empire. But these movements wanted or believed that arts should exist solely for its own. Art should provide pleasure to the senses rather than convey moral or sentimental messages. Decadence movement in late 19th century is setting art free from moral, ethical, and sexual tradition. So it focused more on life and society. Children's literature. So this was the time when childhood was being formed into a time of innocence and freedom, and there was a move away from the previous Puritan belief that all humans are born with sin. So in the Puritan era, if you can still remember, children's were deemed as wicked, and so the literatures produced for them were about morals, teachings, and religious because they sort of needs to be cleansed. But in the Victorian era, children's were deemed as innocent and are free and imaginative. So we have Alice's Adventure in the Wonderland by Lewis Carroll and The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. So these are the famous authors, one of the famous authors in these times. However, the middle class children's are the ones who only have the access to these kinds of books for children's because at these times child labor is rampant and children in the lower class didn't have the access to these kinds of books and even education because as early as 10 they need to work for their family. There are also people who help children to have access to education, especially from the lower class, such as Charles Dickens. He's ragged schools for the working class, but most of the children from the lower class didn't really have the proper education. Science and literature. So at these times, science and literature is also developing. So we have H.G. Wells, or Herbert George Wells, an English writer, prolific in many genres. I've also included one of his famous works, which is The Time Machine. So, Time Machine is about a Victorian scientist known as time traveler who travels approximately 800,806 years into the future. Also, Jules Verne, a prolific French author whose writings laid much of the foundation of the modern science fiction. One of his famous works, A Journey to the Center of the Earth. It is a story of Professor Leidenbrock, his nephew and hired guide who claimed to have found a passage to the center of the Earth, travel deep into the Icelandic volcano. Towards the end of the Victorian era, there is a transition to modernism.
Now let us move to our suggested piece, which entitled Sonnet 38 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So part of her collection of sonnets titled Sonnets from the Portuguese, written as a sequence to her husband, Robert Browning. Sonnets from the Portuguese is a collection of love sonnets by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It first published in 1850. These passionate poems focuses on Browning's affection for her husband, famed poet Robert Browning. So they are among the most famous sonnets in English language. So the title of the collection is deliberately obscure to disguise the personal and romantic nature of the poetry. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a well-known writer and literary reviewer during the Victorian period, and much of her writing is feminist in nature. She is nevertheless best known for these romantic sonnets. To give you another overview about the sonnets of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, sonnets from the Portuguese is comprised of 44 sonnets. Robert Browning used to call his wife the Portuguese, which is why she chose this title. She spent much of her life ill and frail, and she never expected to find love. So the sonnet collection reflects her shift from depression to joy and hopefulness. So she credits her husband with making her feel alive again and giving her the courage to explore the world outside of her family home. So, are you excited to witness what is the sonnet all about? The Sonnet 38 by Elizabeth Robert Browning. So, without further ado, let's start. Before we move pala to the piece, the suggested piece, which is the Sonnet 38 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, let us know first who is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So, quick background about her life with her husband and who she was. So, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, born on March 6, 1806 at Coxhoe Hall, Durham, England. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was an English poet of the Romantic movement. The oldest of 12 children, Elizabeth was the first in her family born in England in over 200 years. For centuries, the Barrett family, who were part Creole, had lived in Jamaica, where they owned sugar plantations and relied on the forced labor of enslaved individuals. Elizabeth's father, Edward Barrett Moulton Barrett, chose to raise his family in England, while his fortune grew in Jamaica. Educated at home, Elizabeth apparently had read passages from John Milton's Paradise Lost and a number of Shakespearean plays, among other great works. Before the age of 10, by her 12th year, she had written her first epic poem, which consisted of 4 books of rhyming couplets. And then 2 years later, Elizabeth developed a lung ailment that plagued her for the rest of her life. So, sadly, the doctors began treating her with morphine, which she would take it until her death. Then, while saddling a pony when she was 15, Elizabeth also suffered a spinal injury rather. So, despite her ailments, her education continued to flourish. Yes, throughout her teenage years, Elizabeth taught herself Hebrew so that she could read the Old Testament. Her interests later turned to Greek studies. Accompanying her appetite for the classics was a passionate enthusiasm for her Christian faith. She became active in the Bible and missionary societies in her church. In 1826, Elizabeth anonymously published her collection, An Essay on Mind and Other Poems. And then 2 years later, her mother passed away. The slow abolition of slavery in England and, mismanagement of the plantations depleted the Barrett's income. And in 1832, Elizabeth's father sold his rural estate at a public auction. He moved his family to a coastal town and rented cottages for the next 3 years before settling permanently in London. While living on the seacoast, Elizabeth published her translation of Prometheus Bound in 1833 by the Greek dramatist Aeschylus. Gaining the attention for her work in the 1830s, Elizabeth continued to live in her father's London house under his tyrannical rule. He began sending Elizabeth's younger siblings to Jamaica to help with the family's estates. Elizabeth bitterly opposed slavery and did not want her siblings sent away. During this time, she wrote the Seraphim and other poems in 1838, expressing Christian sentiments in the form of classical Greek tragedy. Due to her weakening disposition, she was forced to spend a year at the Sea of Turkey, accompanied by her brother Edward, whom she referred to as Bro. He drowned later that year while sailing at Turkey, and Browning returned home emotionally broken, becoming an invalid and recluse. And then she spent the next 5 years in her bedroom at her father's home. She continued writing, however, and in 1844 produced a collection entitled Simply Poems. And this volume gained the attention of the poet Browning, dari na dayon na attract si Robert, whose work Elizabeth had praised in one of her poems, and he wrote her a letter. So from that day on, Elizabeth and Robert, who was 6 years her junior, exchanged 574 letters. No, take note. 574 letters over the next 20 months. Immortalized in 1930 in the play The Barretts of Wimpole Street by Rodolphe Bézier in 1878 to 1942. So their romance was bitterly opposed by her father, who did not want any of his children to marry. Yes, and in 1846, the couple eloped and settled in Florence, Italy, where Elizabeth's health improved and she bore a son, Robert Wideman Browning. Her father never spoke to her again since that day on nga nagkaanak sila ni Robert. Dayon, Elizabeth's sonnets from the Portuguese, dedicated to her husband and written in secret before her marriage, was published in 1850. Critics generally consider the sonnets of the most widely known collections of love lyrics in English to be her best work. Admirers have compared her imagery to Shakespeare and her use of the Italian form to Petrarch. And you know what everyone, what is the saddest part of this is that Elizabeth Barrett Browning died in Robert Browning's arms on June 29, 1861, due to her heart failure after an attack of bronchitis, according to the account that I've read. So now we are now down to the most exciting part of this report, which we will be tackling the suggested piece entitled Sonnet 38 by Elizabeth Robert Browning. I want you all to bear with me as I'm going to read the letter of Mr. Robert Browning to Elizabeth Robert Browning. But as much as I want to ask you first, no, before akong basahon ang letter, gusto to kong mangutana, but I wanted to ask you, what is your, first feelings or first impression when you experienced being kissed by someone? So, no, abot lang kay, I guess tanan naman guro to naka-experience and kiss, right? I don't think so, but I guess so. No, I wanted to ask you, what is your feeling, what is your impression, or how did you interpret that kiss? No, but anyways, let's move now to the letter because wala man po tayo chance kay online naman eh. Let us now read the Sonnet 38. Okay. First time he kissed me, he but only kissed the fingers of this hand wherewith I write, and ever since it grew more clean and white, slow to world greetings, quick with its list. When the angels speak, a ring of amethyst I could not wear here plainer to my sight than that first kiss. The second passed in height the first, and sought the forehead, and half missed, half falling on the hair. Oh, beyond need! That was the chrism of love, which love's own crown, with sanctifying sweetness, did precede. The third upon my lips was folded down in perfect, purple state, since when, indeed, I have been proud and said, my love, my own. So Sonnet 38 is very beautiful because Elizabeth Barrett Browning expresses her feelings, or what is her interpretations, his feelings, since she experienced being kissed. So I know that we really need to dig deeper what is Sonnet 38 all about, but don't you worry because Miss Isaiah Rodriguez will weigh up and give us more information and meaning what is Sonnet 38 all about.
So now that you have a little background about Elizabeth Barrett Browning and you've read her one of her sonnets, which is the Sonnet 38, let us now analyze it. So the Sonnet 38 is Elizabeth Barrett Browning reflection on her experience of being kissed by her beloved, of course, Robert Browning. And in this sonnet, she describes the three different levels of kiss. So the first kiss, Elizabeth Barrett Browning recalls the very first time her beloved kissed her fingers, with which she is now writing the sonnet. The kiss is described as gentle and chaste. She contrasts this with transformative power of love, as her hand is slow to world greetings, but attentive to angels speak. So that is the first kiss, which is the kiss to the hands, to the hand. Second kiss. The second kiss is more passionate, aiming for her forehead, but ending up on her hair. This kiss represents a deeper level of affection and intimacy than the very first kiss. So the very first kiss is on the hand, the second is on the forehead, but ended up on the hair. The third one, the third one is described as the most intense and significant kiss because it lands on her lips and carries a sense of sanctification and perfection. This kiss, in a perfect purple state, symbolizes the pinnacle of their love. So these sonnets describing the levels of kiss that Elizabeth Barrett Browning experienced describes how they love each other, how deep their love to each other, and even these simple gestures, um, they have the power to change one's emotions, the power to help one another to love deeper. Moving on to the themes in the Sonnet 38 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The first one, of course, is love. The poet recalls the how her husband kissed her and how that kiss made her feel. So that is love. Next is time. In sonnet, it is stated there, and time which scars can fathom or foretell, only men's life's omission. This means that time is fleeting and can mend past mistakes. Literary devices, we have imagery and repetition. Imagery, such as, my face turned pale as deadly pale. My legs refused to walk away. And for the repetition, the phrase or words he but only kissed is repeated. This era also is the birth of the love story of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning, and how their literary works sort of changed from before they met, during they met, the letters, and after they met, and how they eloped to Paris, married, and moved to Italy, and stayed there for the rest of their life, and how they made literary works out of their deep connection and love for each other, that even these literary works were still very influential until today. So, in summary, the Victorian era under the ruling of Queen Victoria involves a lot of development, not just in the infrastructure, but also in their literary works. The constitutional monarch, which includes the royalists and the parliament the to rule England, and also the growth of the British Empire, which influences the entire continent. There are famous people who produce dramatic monologues, poetries. They focused on realism rather than imagination, and they produced also books for children. However, in these times, there are moral and ethical concerns such as prostitution, and child labor, the exploitation to the lower class or the laborers, and even to women. And there are prominent people who saw this concerns, and they made significant changes in the way of their literary works. One of them also is Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who's also very active in these issues and produced literary works to at least help people from the lower class or the disadvantaged people.